Good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone joining Gardens of Empire. Tonight's event is part of the series 99 Questions and is dedicated to the critical conversations around the colonial legacy of botanical gardens, plants, and herbariums. We will be learning about colonial collections through botanical gardens and natural history, and moreover, the forms of knowledge production that have ensued of these. For those who are joining for the very first time, 99 Questions is a dialogue format of live events and podcasts that critically examines the historical impact of colonialism and its ongoing repercussions of Western museum practices in the past, the present, and through to the future. For every event, 99 Questions invites international thinkers, experts, and you, the audience, to give space to a collective process of learning and unlearning and transformation, making room for pluriversality, all the while placing the responsibility and accountability on museums front and center. I am delighted to host this first event of 2022 in this series of 99 Questions. My name is Yolanda Rother. I use she, her pronouns. I am the co-founder of the diversity consulting firm, the Impact Company, and a member of the board at Stiftung Zukunft Berlin here in Berlin. A few words for sake of accessibility. I am a German-Jamaican brown woman with an Afro-like hairstyle, and I'm wearing a dark green corduroy jumpsuit. I'm joining you all here from the Humboldt Forum in the center of Berlin. I would be remiss not to mention that the Humboldt Forum, since its very inception, has been a continuous site for tension and contestation and disruptive discussions evoking sentiments such as pain and anger amongst communities, particularly those of color, along with physical encounters such as demonstrations and strong calls to actions around the colonial entanglements of its own practice. I mention this to bring to our awareness the complexity and importance of the site itself as a context for the discussion we are about to have, and also to thank the Humboldt Forum for this invitation to openly engage with the continued struggle for justice and equitable distribution of resources during this world-building moment. Tonight, we are taking a closer look at Gardens of Empire, a conversation about the colonial legacy of the natural sciences, especially that of botany, and how this legacy continues to manifest across different museums, archives, and collections, impacting our knowledge-building capacities and other areas of our racialized and capitalist society. During Germany's colonial era, scientists and professional collectors stole, perhaps robbed, plants, animals, minerals, and objects from colonized lands in the global south. These were later appropriated, classified, renamed, and ordered into museums, according to systems of European thought that claimed universality and neutrality. Colonial warfare, land grabbing, and the plantation and extractive economies both gave access to the acts of collecting in the very first place, but were also the result of the making of knowledge that was used to its advantage. Thus, deconstructing colonialism requires a threefold approach on genocides, epistemicides, ecocides. Today, we will focus on the garden, metaphorically as a site of power, I think we can all agree that a garden is a space of nature that is specifically formed and kept by humans. The title of this event, Gardens of Empire, thus uses the analogy of the garden to point to the human shaping and inventing of nature. Thinking through plants, herbariums, gardens, specimens, and with extractive zones and social ecologies, the conversation looks at the entanglement of knowledge production and colonial extractivism. Tonight, we were supposed to be joined by 3 experts. Unfortunately, one, María Gómez, had to cancel, and her contribution will be taking place at a later point in the series. But I'm glad that we are being joined by 2 exceptional experts, scholars and practitioners in their own right, who will look at practices of collecting, of naming, and of seeing nature. Let me invite to the virtual stage first Meenakshi Menon, a researcher at the Max Planck Institute. Hello, Meenakshi.
Hi.
It's great to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. And I'm so thrilled to have with us as well María Gómez López, who is an interdisciplinary artist. Hello, María.
Hello. Lovely to be here as well.
Great that you're here, and thank you so much. You both will be aiding us in understanding the continued coloniality and also come to understand something such as what the begonia on our balcony has to do with colonialism and why it matters to read these collections critically today, even read against them. You both will have inputs of 25 minutes before we open the floor to a broader discussion. All of you who are joining us virtually are central to this conversation throughout the entire session. We warmly welcome your questions and thoughts, ideas and comments, and have set up a specific platform for this, the VoxR platform. To explain how this platform works, I will now hand over to my dear colleague, Michael Dieminger, who joins me here on stage. Michael, along with Julia Richard, is the curator of 99 Questions, which is being produced in cooperation with the Ethnologisches Museum and the Museum for Asiatische Kunst in Berlin. Michael will be looking over all of your contributions over the course of this evening, and I hand it to him to explain the details. Yeah. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Yolanda. Also a warm welcome from my side. I'm looking forward to this first dialogue in 2022. I will shortly explain you the VoxR tool. It's really easy. You just need your smartphone, your mobile phone, or open up another tab window in your browser. And then you have 2 options. One is there will be a link appearing down here. So you just type in the URL and you can use it. Or if you can go via the Humboldt Forum website, and on the events website you find down there a button, join the discussion. Please just open it into another window, and then you will have the possibility to write questions. After you write on your question, you can also see the questions by other people raised, and you have the chance to vote for questions. To us on the stage then later will appear the 5 votes with the most, the 5 questions with the most votes, and we will ask them for you to the audience. That's it, super easy. And thank you. I'm looking forward to the dialogue today.
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining that, Michael, and very much looking forward to all of your questions around this very interesting conversation. So I would like to introduce our first speaker. Our first guest speaker, Minakshi Menon, is a member of the research group Krause at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science here in Berlin, where she leads a working group. She was educated in India before receiving a PhD in history, science studies from the University of California in San Diego. And Meenakshi's working group studies the plant descriptions and illustrations in the 12-volume Dutch herbal, the Hortus Indicus Malabaricus, and I will mention the years, 1678 to 1693. And your working group studies this in order to understand the botanical knowledge-making practices of Dutch colonists. Minakshi, you are currently also working on a book manuscript titled Empiricism's Empire, Natural Knowledge Making, State Making and Governance in East India Company, India. And we're so thrilled to have you here with us today as you will guide us into this topic, speak about the complex issue of decolonizing herbarium collections and why it's important that we do so. I'd love to directly hand it over to you. The stage is yours, Meenakshi. Enjoy.
Thank you, Yolanda. Thank you for that very warm welcome. So my subject today, the topic, Decolonizing Herbarium Collections, a three-word title that makes the act sound easy. It isn't. Before we can move on to discuss practices of decolonizing herbarium collections and why such decolonization is necessary, there's ground clearing to do. To get to grips with what decolonization and the currently fashionable buzzword decolonial mean, three key concepts require elucidation: colony, colonial, colonialism. The overarching theme within which our event is embedded is called colonialism and coloniality. And as a part of it, Anna María and I have been asked to reflect on the politics of collecting nature as manifested in the creation of gardens of empire. So to begin, what do colony, colonial, and colonialism mean? What is an empire? What does colonialism have to do with empire? A little etymology then. The English word colony is derived from the Latin colonia. Consider the different meanings of the classical Latin word colonia given in Lewis and Short's Latin dictionary. Slide 2, please. A first set gives us a possession in land, a landed estate, a farm. A second gives us a colony, a colonial town, a settlement. Both sets of meanings allude to land. Slide 2, please. Possession in land, or the act of establishing a settlement of people on land. A glance at the etymology of the modern English colony from Middle English colony clarifies its usage. It means a settler in a new country, a farmer, a cultivator, a planter. Further explanation is provided in smaller print from Latin colonia. It thus has the senses of farm, landed estate, settlement, and was especially the proper term for a public settlement of Roman citizens in a hostile or newly conquered country. The act of founding colonies then implied a relationship of power and of property. Semantics followed practice, as evident from the statement by the 17th century English philosopher Francis Bacon, who in the Essays of Council, Civil and Moral of 1625, speaking of plantations, gestured to the violence that often accompanied planting efforts. And this is what he says. He says, I like a plantation in a pure soil, that is, where people are not displanted to the end to plant in others. For else, it is rather an extirpation than a plantation. So, what does the act of founding colonies bring in its wake? Well, violence of different kinds, of a greater or lesser degree, land stolen, people killed, knowledge forms reordered, and the last is what scholars like to call epistemic violence. The word colonial, when we encounter it in everyday context, is often an adjective qualifying, say, furniture or architecture. For example, furniture made in the 18th century American colonies, which followed contemporary European styles, but used locally available woods, and the lathe to produce extensive turnings and so on, is referred to as colonial furniture. When many post-colonial theorists use the word, however, they do so to link, and I quote, the history of the West and its identification with civilization and progress to its colonial genealogy. And I'm continuing the same quote from the historian Frederick Cooper, who explains it thus. The colonial evokes above all the marking of certain people as distinct, in need of special forms of surveillance and supervision and unable to participate fully in the projects of a modernizing society. What that means is this. At a certain point, the meaning of colonization shifted from relating to the occupation and control of land to people. Colonialism came to mean a polity that set up institutions that worked to police boundaries and maintain the hierarchies that allowed one set of people to exercise power over another, that is, to rule over them. Colonialism and the colonial didn't disappear with decolonization. The definition of decolonization, as given in the Oxford English Dictionary, conjures images of a peaceful transfer of power. And I quote, the withdrawal from its former colonies of a colonial power, the acquisition of political or economic independence by such colonies. The most common meaning attached to the word is a formal one, the ceding of formal political control, with colonizers handing over the reins of government to indigenous national elites. But understanding colonialism and decolonization as the introduction or cession of formal political control is to grasp only the proverbial tip of the iceberg. As a set of processes and practices, colonization imposed new property regimes, produced new categories of identity, and created new knowledge forms. These remained in many cases the bases on which post-colonial national identities were constructed and lived on in the new cultural imaginaries associated with decolonization. These current world effects in the post-colonies are accompanied by ways of thinking, habits of mind in the former metropoles, those mother countries in Europe that created colonies in today's geopolitical South, which reproduce in different registers the distinctions marking formerly colonized peoples as unfit participants and partners in the great mission to produce a globalized modernity. The Humboldt Forum's own definition of coloniality underlines this, and once again, I quote, by coloniality, we mean the colonial patterns of thought and action that in their various reconfigurations continuously and sustainably structure today's realities in former colonized and colonizing societies. It has been used to justify the exploitation of and violence and genocide against others, and consolidated the kind of structural racism that continues to discriminate against and even kill non-white people. The Humboldt Forum is committed to breaking out of the coloniality that is also inherent in the traditions and practices of educational and cultural institutions, such as museums. So we've traveled a bit from the etymological origins of the word colony, with which I began. Are we to understand then that colonial and colonialism today pertain primarily to individual distinctions between peoples and the actions taken to maintain such distinctions rather than the forced occupation of land? Not quite. The forms of colonization involved in establishing settlements in newly conquered or hostile territories reveals their effects very clearly today in settler societies turned nations, places such as North America or Australia, which is why two North American Indigenous Studies scholars, Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yong, in a piece called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, argue that appropriating the language of decolonization to describe different projects of social justice, decolonize universities, decolonize museums, decolonize herbarium collections, erases what is most important about colonization, its profoundly material character. Land was stolen, and that its redressal, decolonization, must consist of material reparations. Lands returned to the peoples from whom it was stolen. Slide 4, please. The word is not to be turned into a metaphor for social justice projects, they say. Their argument is pointedly directed at the post-colonial academy's tendency to focus on decolonizing the mind or the cultivation of critical consciousness as if it were the sole activity of decolonization, to allow conscientization to stand in for the more uncomfortable task of relinquishing stolen land. However, in the course of making their argument, Tuck and Wong overlooked differences in patterns of colonization produced by history and context. The question of land ownership and land rights in South Asia, for example, either today or in the past, cannot be addressed by invoking a settler-indigene binary. A complex and layered system of rights in land obtained in pre-colonial South Asia and alliances forged between colonizing British and native elites were vital to stripping subaltern groups of their rights in land. It's no surprise then that a sharp riposte to Tuck and Wong should appear from the pen, or rather the keyboard, of an Indian-born academic, Priyamvada Gopal, professor of post-colonial studies at the University of Cambridge. 2 points made by Gopal in her essay on decolonization and the university are worth noting. First, her definition of colonialism, and this is what she says, and I quote, "Colonialism might be broadly understood in all its variety as a project of expansionist, racialized capitalism." And she says there is no context to which this definition would not be applicable in some way. Slide 3, please. If we accept this definition, then anti-colonialism, which Tuck and Wong deprecate, she says, emerges as the different kinds of resistance to this project. Second, she insists that we be attentive to the wider historical context within which Europe itself and its knowledge-making institutions, universities, museums, etc., constituted themselves and accumulated the materials on which their knowledge-making is based. That is, the flow of resources and profits from colonies to the mother countries. She speaks here of European universities, but her reflections are equally relevant to museums as pedagogical spaces. Slide 5, please. Arguably, she says, it is precisely this well-documented relationship between the institutions of knowledge production in Europe and its colonial endeavors, outlined by Edward Said, among others, that makes the question of decolonization not only relevant, but vital to the Metropolitan University. Any institution in the business of gathering, producing, and disseminating knowledge is called upon to understand how it has constituted itself, as well as the materials and methodologies it works with. Precisely because of their location, Western universities can also lead the increasingly vital task of historical self-understanding. In the constituent polities and societies of the geopolitical West, itself a creation of the colonial project and its imaginative geography. Gopal's definition of colonialism as a project of expansionist racialized capitalism helps answer the question I asked at the beginning of this presentation regarding the relationship of colony to empire. The word imperium and its significance and its signification shifted over time meant, loosely speaking, sovereignty exercised over territory embracing different political communities. The 18th and 19th century British Imperium in South and Southeast Asia, for example, consisted of an extended system of groups of people in different political relationships. Such an exercise of sovereignty produced what Frederick Cooper, the historian, has called empire states, polities without a clear national core or contiguous territorial existence, which functioned as zones of exploitation and as spaces for moral debate about the issues raised by colonization, the legitimacy of slavery, religious conversion, forced labor, and so on. It is within such empire states that racialized capitalism did its best work. This can be illustrated by the material and symbolic importance of the East India Company's botanic gardens in 18th and 19th century India. And one garden in particular, the Calcutta Botanic Garden, which I'll call the CBG. The CBG was an expression of state paternalism and soft power and acted as a distinct historical force in colonial governance. Its role in stewarding land and caring for the colonized by distributing drought-resistant plants and locating famine foods gave its personnel, both European and native, a sympathetic character, setting them apart from actors associated with the direct use of state violence. Botanical and agronomical research at the garden was an effort to embed the East India Company state in its Indian milieu. But it was also an expression of the sovereignty of the empire state, enabling the cross-continental transplantation of plants and the circulation of scientific labor and personnel among British botanic gardens in the Indian Ocean region and beyond. The CBG was founded in 1786 by Colonel Robert Kidd, Secretary of the East India Company's Military Department of Inspection in Bengal, who was keenly aware of its possible benefits for the security of Britain and its empire. Research carried out by Kidd and his successors, the East India Company surgeons William Roxburgh and Nathaniel Wallich, proceeded along two related axes: internal improvement to increase the colonial state's revenues and commercial agriculture. Kidd, Roxburgh, and Wallich studied the possibility of treating the garden as an experimental station for the growth of commercially valuable crops in India, thus obviating the need for Britain's West Indian slave plantations. They also explored Bengal's agrarian economy in order to gauge its potential for improvement, studying soil conditions, crops grown in the area around the CBG, and irrigation practices. There were two main foci of attention. The first was the cultivation of drought-resistant crops that could be distributed to drought-prone areas around the northern and western Bay of Bengal. The second was the promotion of sugarcane cultivation by private British investors in order to undercut the West Indian sugar monopoly. British Empire state sugar politics and campaigns by abolitionists in Britain were to profoundly affect the role of the CBG as an experimental garden. During debates on the abolition of the slave trade, sugar from Asia was proposed as a cheap alternative to slave sugar. Roxburgh tried experiments with Chinese sugarcane varieties at the garden, and by the mid-1790s, had succeeded in sending musters of sugar from China, Batavia, that is Jakarta, and Bengal to the East India Company Court of Directors in London. Meanwhile, the Bengal Commercial Society rented land from the East India Company to try out the Caribbean plantation model in Bengal. The society wanted permission to import equipment from the West Indies and 20 African slaves as sugar makers, but their request was refused. So you can see here the relevance of Gopal's definition of colonialism as racialized capitalism. Through the late 18th and 19th centuries, the CBG became a repository for the living plant resources of the Indian Ocean world, seeds, wild species, and domesticated improved species of commercially valuable plants. Rapidly accumulating treasures at the garden also included herbaria, collections of dried and preserved plant specimens, and paintings by numerous native artists of plant species with records of their local names in different Indian languages. Stabilizing the local names of commercially valuable plant species to make them yield to the globalizing power of Linnaean nomenclature and classification was one of the great challenges that faced the botanists associated with the Calcutta Garden. As a commercial corporation, the East India Company had not only to keep its supply chains active, but also protect any intelligence it gathered about the sources of therapeutic commodities of value in European and Asian markets out of the hands of competitors. The polysemy exhibited by plant names in Indian languages, a single plant could have many names, while the same name could apply to different plants, made developing a method to identify and name unfamiliar Indian plants through Linnaean categories imperative and very, very difficult. I won't say more on this now because María will be discussing the issue of indigenous naming and European nomenclature in detail. Instead, I'll move on to address the subject indicated by my title, Herbarium Collections and Why We Should Decolonize Them. Herbaria, as I've already mentioned, consisted of collections of dried specimens of plants intended for scientific study and are found in botanic gardens and museums the world over. Herbarium specimens are usually vascular plants. They have water-conducting tissue. Those that are easily pressed are mounted onto sheets of paper with a descriptive label attached and contain a plant's reproductive and vegetative organs, which are essential for species identification in plants. Plant parts that cannot be easily pressed, tubers and bulbs, for instance, are usually dried and placed in boxes along with the specimen concerned. Late 18th and 19th century techniques for creating herbaria in colonial gardens in India paid special attention to the quality of paper. European paper, lots of it, was always preferred to local or country-made paper, which was liable to infestation by insects. We know that European-style drying frames and pressing boards were sometimes used in the Calcutta Garden, and that by the second half of the 19th century, modes of preserving herbarium specimens included the use of camphor. Slide 6, please. An herbarium sheet with a dried plant attached looks like this. This particular herbarium sheet is taken from a 12-volume collection called the Plantae Malabaricae, on which I've been working, owned by the University of Göttingen. It was collected during the Danish Tranquebar mission to South India in 1732-33 in the area of Tarangambadi or Tranquebar, which is today in the modern Indian state of Tamil Nadu in Southeast India. Slide 7, please. And there is a colored illustration of the same plant taken from an 18th century herb. The reasons why easy access to herbaria is vital for botanical research are many, but there's one of particular importance, the ability to consult lectotypes or type specimens. So what are lectotypes? Well, they are the means through which the continuity and fixity of botanical names are maintained. A botanist who names a newly discovered species attaches the name to a single individual plant specimen and not to the whole species. Such specimens, usually preserved in herbaria, must be consulted when questions arise regarding species definition or names. Sometimes lectotypes are created from an illustration, that is an iconotype, as in my example here, slide 8, please. And here is a plant, it's called Valeriana Jatamansi Jones, and its lectotype is from the Asiatic Researches of 1790, the Calcutta edition. And this is a plant on which I have done considerable research. A botanist doing research on plant nomenclature must be able to travel to the museum or botanical garden that holds the type specimen she's interested in, which given the legacy of colonial botanical practices is usually in a country in the geopolitical north. And Ana María will say much more about this. The resource inequalities between the post-colonial nations of the global north and south mean that botanists in the global south usually lack the ability to visit museums and gardens in the global north. The playing field, then, for researchers in the global south is far from level. The process of decolonizing herbarium collections in order to be fundamentally reparative must ensure that funds are readily available, no questions asked, no strings attached. For any researcher from the global south wishing to travel north to conduct research. Slide 5, please. This is but a small example of the kind of decolonizing steps that late capitalist societies of the geopolitical north must take to keep alive the memories of the relentless extraction of others' resources that marked colonialism as a project of expansionist, racialized capitalism. Slide 3, please. Even as these nations work to undo its effects. Thank you very much.
Yeah, a virtual applause, a real applause. Thank you so much, Minakshi, Menon, for this wonderful insight. I've really learned so much in listening to you, and I want to just thank you so much for your presentation. I also want to encourage everyone who has listened and enjoyed this to please add your comments, your thoughts, your questions, perhaps even some concerns that you may have through the VoxR tool. Before we hand it over to Ana María, our next speaker, I would love to ask you one question, Meenakshi. You really took us on a tour de force right now of the history of herbarium, bringing out a few examples. But I would like to know on what time it is for you on the world clock of decolonizing herbarium collections. What would you say?
Well, I think I've indicated that the time is way past to undo current scientific practices of naming and classification of plants. They have power, they're located in the old mother countries, they're here to stay, and we have to find ways of working with that.
Yeah, thank you so much for this insight. I'm looking forward to the ensuing conversation and would now love to welcome on the virtual stage our next speaker. It is my pleasure to invite Ana María Gómez López to the stage. Her projects use botanical specimen, prosthetic implants, lens-based media, and recorded sound to explore the shifting boundaries between humans and their natural environment, often in relation to archival research in the history of the life sciences. Your work, Ana María, has been exhibited across Europe. You have held fellowships at the International Institute for Social History, the Oslo Library for the History of Medicine, the Beinecke Rare Books and Manuscripts Library, and the Max Planck Institute for History of Science, where you were also a member of the Animal Mobilities Working Group in the Department 3. It is so exciting to have you here, and I'm really thrilled to hear more about your interdisciplinary artist practice and hand over to you. The stage is yours. Thank you.
Well, what a lovely introduction. Thank you very much, Yolanda. And thank you, Meenakshi, for a fantastic talk. It's really going to be hard to follow up on so many very nodded and lovingly exposed questions, but thank you very much for this. I tried to live up to your caliber. I am going to have a two-part talk, all centered around an artwork whose title is Inoculate, as you see here in this presentation. Next slide, please. Very briefly, I want to lay out that the project involved growing a Begonia sempervirens seed in my right eye. And I will talk about the Begonia sempervirens as a species in the second part of this talk. But for now, I invite you to look at this dictionary definition of the word inoculate, which, while many of us will be familiar with it due to the vaccination campaigns and this ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and who have, probably experienced the inoculation of the virus themselves, I want to point out that the original etymological departure of this word comes from horticulture. And it is quite literally to put something in the eye of a plant. And by eye here, you can mean the bud, you can mean a cutoff of a stem. There are several ways you can interpret an eye, or an eye of a root, for example, in the case of a tuber. But I take this figurative idea of an eye and I make it quite literal to the human eye. Next slide, please. And so in doing so, I'm going to walk you now through each step. And hopefully you will see why a consideration of the species becomes very important when we think perhaps on the oculocentric element of much of epistemological projects from the West, and talking about it in the context of decolonization. But to start with, let's literally go to the eye, and to very specifically, you might see it very faintly, but there are two red dots that are the top and bottom lacrimal duct. And a lacrimal duct is where your tears actually flow into your nose. For those of you who are not familiar with ocular anatomy, I will say that the tears come from a gland that is in the opposite side of the eye, not where the duct is, but actually on the upper right-hand corner or upper left-hand corner, if we're talking about the other eye. And they irrigate and moisturize, and of course, help eliminate elements that are difficult or obstruct your vision, or difficult for the surface of the eye. Next slide. So this is my own tear duct, my own lower right tear duct, which is the site of this self-experiment. I work with my body as an artist. I describe it as body-based durational work, not so much performance, because for me, often when I work with my body, I'm trying to create a self-experiment, not just for myself, but to ultimately have a record of it that could be reproduced by another person if they wish, or to have it be something that they consider as a thought experiment, even if they don't carry it out step by step on themselves. Next slide, please. And this is the device that made possible this ocular germination. So in the tear duct, which is the part of the body we have seen in the previous two slides, I placed a very small silicone plug. It's called a silicone punctal plug. And it is an ophthalmological device for people who have very dry eyes. Some of you in the audience might even have it. In previous occasions, when I've spoken about inoculate, I'm often surprised when at the end of a talk, somebody shares to me the fact that they are wearing this device at that very moment. But it's used to collect tears, to collect lacrimal fluid. And basically it occupies that capsule without ever going into your nasolacrimal passage. So all those tears stay in the plug and eventually go back to irrigating your eye. As you can see, it's very small. It's only 0.4 millimeters in diameter. It barely in its length occupies 2 of the rings of my fingertip and my fingerprint. So it's really quite a minute object, and it matches an equally minute seed. Next slide. Thank you. But before we get to the seed, in terms of talking about this as an ophthalmological device, wanted to show you the instrument that is usually utilized to make the plug go into the tear duct. This is a cannula. It might look like a needle. It might look like it's a sharp metal object, but it's actually not. It's a very blunt and non-piercing tip. I'm talking here about the one on the upper right-hand side. And you will see a close-up of this where you can, in fact, see that it's not meant to puncture. It's literally meant as a placement device. Next slide. Here we are with a macro photograph of exactly that same metal tip. You might wonder why in one it tends to look more silvery and another one it gathers this bronze sort of look. It's really because it's an aluminum alloy, and the way that light refracts actually creates this chromatic difference between the two images, but I assure you it's the same device. And you will see that what looked to be the tip of the cannula is actually just a base for an even smaller little sort of extension that comes out of the tip, which is something that easily can mimic, for example, a mechanical pencil or a pen. It actually is something just by squeezing the device I showed before, you get sort of the extension. And in the tip of this extension, you see a begonia seed. So hopefully this will, again, visually reinforce how small an object we're talking about, an element. Next slide. This is a not very good photograph, but the only one I have of the placement of the seed in the plug. So I used the applicator, which you saw before, with the begonia seed, Begonia simpleferens seed on its tip, placed it inside the plug, the seed inside the plug, and then put everything in my tear duct, sort of creating an assemblage. Normally, one only puts in the plug. In this case, because I wanted to make sure not to lose the seed, I put the seed in first. Next slide. If you could magnify the plug in the actual tear duct, this is what it would look like. I often get asked, was this a painful process? Was this something that you knew how to do before? How did you maneuver that interface of the body? And because I hope that your attention goes to the seed, which I will get to in a moment, I just want to assure you that this project, Inoculate, as a body-based project, wasn't meant to transcend a threshold of pain or uncomfort. That's sometimes something that artists do to have the public exposition of physical strain and endurance be part of the artwork, and often to great effect. And it serves a historical lineage, which I will not get into here. But this particular project with the body was not meant to do that. In fact, it's meant to be something, again, that other people could imagine doing themselves. And for all of us who wear glasses, or perhaps have even worn contact lenses and have had the experience of touching our eyeball with our fingertip and trying to manipulate sometimes a very rebellious object right immediately in the surface of our eye, I can assure you that was more invasive for me as a young person trying to learn to wear contacts than anything I did for this project. So next slide. And this, I felt, is the final kind of element that made this project possible, but I wanted to also have you see it not for what we perhaps might simplify in our mind as what lacrimal fluid looks like when we don't look at it through a microscope, but this is an actual tear, one of my basal tears, that I took a microphotograph of with someone called María, who is based in The Hague. And it gives you kind of, hopefully within the world of a very small assemblage, kind of what it actually can look like. Tears are not just there to humidify. They spread oxygen, for example, in our eyeball. You have lipids, so fats also that are made to actually, contain some of the enzymes and some of the minerals and the properties of the lacrimal fluid, not just as a moisturizing device, but actually something that can provide a protective layer. So the complexity of tears, as well as the complexity of seeds, was something that became part and parcel of carrying out this project. Next slide, please. This is the actual box in which the silicone puntal plug and the applicator came in. I always get a kick about the fact that it's called Oasis. And in this artificial sort of set of circumstances for ocular germination, I cannot help to think the reinforcement of sort of ideas of liquid or water management are projected even in some parts of our life that are not immediately directly linked to it. But for another time. Next slide. And this is me wearing an eye shield that allowed for some light to come in a very controlled way. You might see that this has some very small perforations. It's something that often gets used by patients that have had ocular surgery, which was not my case, but merely it was a way to control the amount of light that was coming in to the surface of my eye, and also for the seed, because begonia seeds, begonia simpleferens seeds at least, tend to grow in mottled shadows, so in a mix of light and dark, rather than with direct sunlight. It also helped me stop touching my eye, because as you can see, I wear glasses and it's almost, every other minute I'm sort of moving my glasses and trying to see a little better. So this took away the temptation of accidentally sort of touching the part of my eye where my glasses normally were. Next slide. In order to maximize the amount of light for the begonia simpleferens seed to grow, I decided that the most effective thing I could do was lay as still as possible and try to be very close to a source of light, a constant source of soft sunlight. And this is a bed table that I made in my apartment at the time that was slightly higher than my bed, which is why I used it, to be able to actually be closer to the ceiling, which had a skylight. Next slide, please. This is said skylight. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. So I'll ask them for the next slide. And this, to sum up what has been prior a very lengthy discussion on the logistics of the self-experiment, is one of the images of the result of the self-experiment. As with all the elements, they are all equally small. So perhaps I have to invite you to look at the lower right-hand corner of this photograph, so at the edge of where the tear duct is, and you will see a very small green sprout that's emerging. It actually might look like as if it's slightly flattened. In fact, that is the case. I did not know when I carried out this self-experiment that it would be successful. And one of my surprises was realizing just how heavy our eyelids are. and how much blinking actually can flatten a very fragile plumule or a very fragile sprout. And it was something that, amidst the surprise of seeing the result of a process that took probably from beginning to end 18 months to see if I could carry out. Aside from that joy of seeing that it was possible, I was equally surprised at how I did not think perhaps of the most obvious thing that would interfere with growth of the germinated seed. I knew, of course, that there would be a limit to how much it could grow in the eye, because as once it was occupying the plug, it would have no more space to root. However, this was an unexpected surprise. You can also see a fair amount of lacrimal fluid collected next to my eye, and that's the result of the plug, as I was mentioning before. Next slide, please. This is, again, just kind of to go for the end of this project, an image of the plug once it was removed from my body with said sprout. It's, as you can see, or perhaps I might point you to it, at the edge of the plug, you can almost see the partition of the stem. That's because I use the same applicator, which you saw before, to be able to carry out this process. So it was invasive from the start. I knew that the sprout would likely not survive in just taking out the plug. But nevertheless, this is as it was once it left the eye. Next slide. This is an image I borrow from somebody at Ohio State University, actually a master's student there, who documented very closely what the growth process was like. This is a far more magnified image to the one that you saw before of my own documentation of the project, but you can see the steps in which the radical and the first leaves and stem look like in this species. This is exactly Begonia sempervirens. Next slide. But finally, so much of a lead up of an artwork that had such an intimate connection to a seed, of which I knew very little to start this project. In my own blind spot, I did not know several key things about the Begonia sempervirens that have now become the dominant part of how I read this project and how I continue to work on this project. Because the ending of ocular germination was actually a beginning. And I have here an image of Begonia sempervirens taken at Wageningen University at the Wageningen Electron Microscopy Center. That's here in the Netherlands. And you see, first of all, what I consider to be a beautiful honeycomb shape of this seed, which has many evolutionary properties to it that I completely disregarded in just looking for a seed that was small enough to fit the plug, the silicone punto plug I mentioned. That was my only criteria in choosing the Begonia sempervirens. In a way, I feel the species chose me because of some of the subsequent research I've done. Next slide. Which bring me to finally perhaps meeting Meenakshi's wonderful presentation with a suggestion that has benefited from the previous conversations we've had to this actual event, also with Julia, Yolanda, and Michael. And it has been very wonderful to be able to share some thoughts that I had only kept to myself and find a forum, quite literally, to discuss them with. But you will see here the name Begonia sempervirens crossed out. And I have decided symbolically to do this after Inoculate was complete, when I started learning about what was in fact its history as a species, of which, again, I did not know anything prior to the beginning of this project. I'll come back to this idea of erasure, and hopefully we can talk about it also jointly amongst the three of us with Minakshi and Yolanda. But following this, I will ask, please, for the next slide. This was the seed packet that I had for getting the one seed I used for the ocular germination, as well as for many tests I did outside of my eye with artificial tears, also in the same silicon punctal plug. At the time I thought, well, I normally don't buy something from, agricultural corporations to begin with. So let's start with a small supplier. Let's not go for a, mainstream commercial source of Begonia sempliferens. Now, I should say here, if you're not familiar with Begonia sempliferens, is that they're ubiquitous, at least in the two parts of Europe where I've lived, which is Germany and the Netherlands. You might see other species of begonia. In fact, there's 2,000 species of Begoniaceae, and it's an extraordinarily diverse species, but many of the ones you will find are hybrids. I did not know this, but the Begonia sempliferens seed that I use, in fact, is something that I could not find in a natural context, but was hybridized in Berlin at the Berlin Botanical Garden. Next slide. And this is the book that made Begonia sempliferens exist for other botanists. At the time, begonia, of course, as a genus already existed, but it was really with this book that was produced in 1828 in Berlin by Link and Otto, who are two well-known figures in the history of botany, that they are referred to, in fact, as adjoinment with the mention of Begonia sempliferens in the botanical literature. So when you see Begonia sempliferens, more often than not, you're going to see the names Link and Otto right afterwards. And this is sort of the imprint of a moment of hybridization, but also a moment of naming. Next slide, please. For those of you who read Latin, this is the actual excerpt of a book where Begonia sempliferens is described and which the name is provided. This particular book did not have an image or an accompanying illustration of the species. I won't take you through all the text, which is mostly a description of the qualities, the visual properties of the plant, but I will just point to the fact that it was recovered in Brazil, in southern Brazil, near Porto Alegre. This is something that Link and Otto describe in their work. Next slide. And this is the actual holotype that exists at the Berlin Botanical Garden. And it's very special. You might not see the handwritten script in the bottom, but it says it was recovered on the 25th of October in 1828 near the vicinity of Rio Pardo, which is a part of Brazil, indeed, in southern Brazil. And by holotype here, I'm referring to the name, the actual technical name that is used for an example of a particular species that is serving as the model for all others that might exist, for which you have the first exemplar that was named. So it's sort of the first step into officializing a species into a biodiversity index, for example, or into a natural historical collection in the past. It's a significant moment of inception for botany, at least understood under Western premises as a discipline. Next slide, please. It's very rare that this specimen survived because much of the Berlin Botanical Garden was destroyed, and much of the herbaria, in fact, was destroyed during the war. And it was only because this was part of a collection that had been taken out of the herbarium, I believe, for an exhibition. And luckily, it survived the bombing. So this was, again, something I did not know about the Begonia sempliferens, that it had been hybridized in Berlin, that it had come from originally southern Brazil, and that in fact the holotype is something of extreme value because it survived in a context where many other holotypes, actually many from Brazil, did not. Next slide, please. This is the actual first illustration, as far as I have been able to identify, of a Begonia sempervirens. It was done by William Jackson Hooker, and it was included in the Curtis Botanical magazine. I could be wrong on this. I'm not myself a historian of science or a historian of botany, but I'm fairly certain that this was the first visual image we had of Begonia sempervirens, and it was done in the UK. Next slide. But this is how many of you might see a Begonia sempervirens now, be it at a nursery, be it at a supermarket, be it on your balcony, as Yolanda said before. It is a very common plant. I see it all the time in gardens, in indoor horticultural arrangements. And I just wanted to give you a visual for those of you who might not be so plant inclined. Next slide. But this is actually another starting point for the species, and in many ways, a starting point for what I hope will be something we can discuss together about what does one do for purposes of reparation in the context of decolonization, as Meenakshi has already walked us through so wonderfully in her presentation. So the person who first named the genus, so not the species, but the genus, in binomial nomenclature, you have first the genus and then the species. This case, it was in the 17th century. So, prior to Lincoln Otto in Berlin hybridizing the Begonia sempervirens, we're talking about roughly 130 years or so, when in the 1690s, a Franciscan monk named Plumier, Charles Plumier, was actually in Saint-Domingue, which is what we now understand or call Haiti, and is the one of the scientists also doubling as a missionary for Michel Begon and the French colonizers of Saint-Domingue. Michel Begon is the intendant, which I see sometimes translated also as governor. I'm not quite sure of the actual rank, but what I do know is that Michel Begon was a military man, and so was his son, who was subsequently the governor, one of the first governors of French Canada. And so there was a certain authority figure that was imprinted immediately onto the begonia by Charles Plumier, who named the begonia in tribute to his patron or his immediate representative of the French government in Saint-Domingue in this colonial context. And we see here an illustration that is actually a secondary illustration. It was the book that Plumier produced, Nova Plantarum Americanum, is from the late 17th century, but arguably it was an Amsterdam edition of this book in 1755 that became sort of far more widespread. And this image that you see here is precisely of this, taken from the plate of Plumier's original work, but reproduced in this sort of mass edition. And you will see that I have taken the liberty of crossing out the name begonia, because what I think, and what I hope to get into the discussion, I'll wrap it up pretty soon, is that in a way, the most concrete thing that we could do with a plant is highlight the fact that its name is something that is not neutral, and that its subsequent sort of intellectual history has to be seen from its moment of naming. Next slide, please. Why do I say this? More specifically, among the many blind spots that I had in talking about or working with begonias, and particularly Begonia sempervirens, was that when I learned its naming, I had to see if there was in fact any other previous mention or examples or representations or references to begonia. I felt uncomfortable with my own blind spot. Junot Diaz says blind spot is always the size of your privilege. And having had training as a biologist, as a human biologist, but as a biologist nonetheless, I had a very strong fixation to nomenclature, but did not think of questioning this particular plant when I first saw that nomenclature. I have been very I've had the benefit of having teachers that are very critical, for example, of the naming of Homo in relationship to Pan or chimpanzees. I sort of had a knowledge of where nomenclature could be problematic. But in this particular space, I was amazed that I never thought to question it until after the project. Perhaps by the shock of it working, I felt I had to learn far more about Begonia sempervirens upon its ending than in the beginning. And what I learned was that, in fact, the first herbarium to have a representation of a begonia that we know of is the Badiano Codex, the De la Cruz and Badiano Codex, which you see here, the first page. And that was a herbarium that was produced in 1552 by two Nahuatl-speaking scholars, one actually Xochimilca and the other Mixteca, and one called Martín Badiano and Juan de la Cruz. Martín was doing the actual process of writing and illustrating in Nahuatl, and Badiano was doing the translation. Next slide. And you see here the actual, to the best of my knowledge, the first representation of a begonia in the Americas. I have since learned that begonias have been, represented for millennia in China, of which I could not speak to in any way fairly. I know at least the Americas context better, not being a historian, but being originally from Colombia. But what I'm trying to say here is that there's a very long history that preceded the entry of the Spanish to what is now called Mexico and what was then New Spain, which for me really exemplifies the kind of structural violence that is embedded not just in the moment of naming, but also in the moment of representation. You see here in Latin, in the bottom, actually, no, I should start first from the very most important thing. Ohuaxocoyolin, which I'm sure is not the appropriate way of saying it in Nahuatl, is the name of what we now think is, in fact, a begonia. And it has underneath its representation the word glaucoma. And subsequently in Latin, you have the treatment, the use of the roots and the stems of this particular plant as something that once it's dried out and made into a powder is applied as sort of a pumice onto the eyes. And it speaks to a very long tradition of health and medical knowledges in these cultures, in Mixteca and Xochimilca cultures. But also for me, when I see this page now, I can't help thinking of multiple forms of confinement, because on the one hand, this herbarium, the first that was made in the Americas, was done in the context of a school called, actually, can you please, next slide, sorry. This is the school, the Colegio de Tlatelolco, which was done as a way of having the Spanish settle their control in what is now Mexico by starting with an educational system for indigenous nobility. And the people who could attend the school were members of different indigenous communities that were all trained in Latin and sort of in scholarship across the sciences, but it was primarily a way for Spanish missionaries to be able to access this information that was then used for the purposes of catechism, missionary work, and general control of the population, to put it very broadly. And what strikes me then, when I first learned about this, and which strikes me even more now, having lived through a pandemic, was that Martín de la Cruz and Juan Badiano would have been not only members of an indigenous elite, but they would have also been survivors at that point of several waves of epidemics that moved through their territories after the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521. Next slide. It is impossible to not see the Badiano Codex made in the Colegio de Tlatelolco through the lens of other codexes that were made in the same place. And I'm speaking here, for example, of the Florentine Codex done a couple of decades later, and which shows, among many ways, a timeline of different collective moments of illness, very dramatically represented as these sort of lingering and constant aftermath of the violent takeover of Mexico. And when I think of two survivors of this context, writing what will then become a herbaria used for many purposes, but amongst them as a way of codifying indigenous knowledge in terms that had equaled or paralleled the codification of knowledge in the West, I felt that this was really kind of the final moment where I thought, well, the name Begonia sempervirens simply cannot hold. Next slide. I will draw my conversation to a close, or rather my presentation to a close so we can get to the conversation. But I wanted to highlight that among many sort of side projects that this Inoculate has taken me on, I've tried to find as many Begonia sempervirens, but also begonias more generally in herbarias, in existing herbaria. And this one from Emily Dickinson, which is at the Houghton Library at Harvard, I found to be particularly moving, more so because I don't know for a fact that it is a Begonia sempervirens, because what you see at the bottom right-hand corner is an unlabeled specimen of begonia. You just see the white stripe affixing this in place. And the idea of being able to erase or at least draw attention to a name by having its absence or its crossout be what you encounter is something that I tried to describe earlier, but which I will now finalize with a few closing thoughts. Next slide. Inevitably, at the beginning of Inoculate, I had described to you also the definition that inspired the title for this project. But now, after most of what I have described, I cannot help but see it as an attempt to offer a critical framework for oculocentric epistemological frameworks altogether, of which illustrations of plants are one piece of a very large puzzle, but where perhaps my own sense of having a project that was so focused in the eye, but actually lent itself for me not seeing for the period of 12 days that it took for ocular germination to take place, was actually a moment of being able to imagine what it would be to approximate specimens not through the codification of Western biological training, but actually through something far more open. And it's now that sort of critique to an oculocentric disciplinary optic, as it were, that I'm thinking the real title comes to fruition. Next slide. So as one of several ways of reacting to the name, I again explained perhaps with everything prior why I have this cross out. But I'm hoping that in the discussion we now have amongst the three of us with Yolanda and Meenakshi, we can talk about other concrete ways of possible reparation, some of it perhaps falling more in the symbolic and speaking to equally sort of a trained elite in a different way, perhaps far removed from the generations of people who have been most affected by this kind of extraction of botanical specimens, of which decidedly Begonia sempervirens is one of them, but also to try to imagine what is collapsed in the extraction of a specimen. So when I mentioned Begon, I have not been able to find a document that attests this, but it does not take much of a stretch to imagine that among the military interests that Begon was looking over were economic interests. He was directly linked to the spice trade, this much I know. And of course, the slave trade would have been something that he would have also had, at least his descendant, made very explicit, his son in French Canada, as something that was part of this economic project. In fact, Michel Begon's son was among the first to introduce slavery as part of the French economic project in Canada, many years after his father had died, but nonetheless begging the question of the structures that made this initial extraction possible. And I think that there are ways of dealing with it in the present that might not be as symbolic as this, but sitting on this side of the screen in the arts, I would say that this is the first one that I think is quite tangible. It would take, I think, very little effort to start crossing out the name of a species in, for example, the Global Biodiversity Index or the plant list or so many other of these compilations of plants. And it would at least beg the question, why is it crossed out, to what we will see perhaps in the discussion might lend to other related dialogues about reparations. But thank you very much for listening. I am thrilled again to be here and to be able to discuss this with you further. And yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ana María, for this incredible and fascinating work that you're doing. It's really incredible to hear and see everything that you have been working on with the begonia, the conclusions that you are in the process of bringing out, but also have already brought to the forefront. And I just want to give another big thank you for sharing this insight and for doing this experiment. Of course, I have so many questions around the practicalities of specifically your self-experiment. But I would suggest that we jump straight into the discussion with Meenakshi and Ana María. And yeah, take on that last point that you, Ana María, mentioned, which is this framework of naming and the practice of naming. And I would like to know from the both of you, perhaps, what this future naming framework could look like in an effort to reparate. Ana María, would you like to give it another shot?
Yes. Well, I have to here, give a very strong nod to Minakshi, because in the conversations leading up to this event, she brought to my attention Gayatri Spivak's introduction to On Grammatology by Derrida. And it, was clearly, I did not, in crossing out, in my own word processing software or putting on the website of this project, which is manual.vision, sort of the cross out of the name, I did not realize that I should be falling on the amazing wealth of literary scholars or scholars that have read against the grain and had to look at documents that reinforce authority in a way that is both explicit and implicit. So I have to thank Meenakshi for pointing me to that, especially in the context of Gayatri Spivak reading of Derrida, and sort of the idea that, an intervention in print or in be it digital or printed matter is a place to start. As we said in our conversation leading up to this event, it might not be realistic to rename every single botanical species, although I do think some are, like the Begonia sempliferens, should and be renamed, especially when you have a concrete link to this kind of colonial past. But I think the idea of crossing out is certainly not beyond what we could do. It's an easy typographic intervention. It's something that presses can do. And it starts speaking to a moment, which is certainly not one that I'm alone in raising. There are certainly other people who have said the same, not for Begonia sempliferens, but for other species. But it seems very practical as a way to start hoping to decolonize botany as a discipline.
Meenakshi, what is your take on this? Do you think that we are walking into a future of crossing out names in an effort to give back indigenous names? Believe you need to
Well, it would be lovely if we could actually do that. I am skeptical only because I am aware of the power of naming and the power that scientific names have on the imagination today. So I would like this kind of naming under erasure to occur, but I'm not sure it can happen. And related to that, I have a question for Ana María, which is, what is the name of the Begonia semperflorens in Nahuatl?
Well, it would be a hybrid name, and the name Oaxacocoyolin means bitter stems and bitter roots. Semperflorens highlights the floral as in a way flattening sort of the medicinal properties of the begonia plant. Knowing that it's not the same species, one being sort of originally from the area that the Badiano and the La Cruz Codex were made, and the other one being a hybrid made 2-3 centuries later, almost in Berlin. I would say that at least a recognition of the total emptiness or the emptying out of its previous history as a medicinal object, as falling into a different epistemological structure. Because I even think with medicinal, I might be framing it in a very sort of utilitarian way. That is something that I think, if not a cross out, some kind of mention, a footnote, a recognition in current catalogs printed thus far. I don't know that I could be the one to offer an alternative name, but I certainly think that the point of origin of always, having an implicit reference to a French colonial authority is just something I personally can't do anymore. So I take the symbolic license now to use this as a practice.
Yeah, thank you so much for elaborating on that, Ana María. And I think that there's a lot of power in that act of crossing out specific names where we are so clearly conscious of the fact that they have a colonial background. And I think it also goes in part against the perhaps social amnesia and the collective forgetting that takes place around exactly some of these naming practices. I would like to move us forward into the direction of what role, what transparency can institutions such as museums and universities have in this process of decolonizing. Specifically looking at the restitution, I'm wondering specifically, what is the role, what is the accountability that a university and a museum can have to be a part of this process of decolonizing? And I would ask this question to Minakshi first, but please go ahead.
Right, so one thought I have because I think about this a lot in the context of India, which is where I'm from, is
Good.
to make deliberate efforts to restore marginalized epistemologies. Mm-hmm. When you display a plant, if you are to give it the current botanical name, there is absolutely no reason why you could not equally include the name in several languages or a single language, and point viewers towards the fact that it refers to properties that have nothing to do with the flower itself. And that is often the case with plants as they are named in Ayurveda, as they are named in Sanskrit verse lexicons, for poets to assist them to construct meters. So this is something that we could do as a deliberate act inside museums as a way forward. I'm not sure whether we would manage to get this done, say, in the biodiversity index or the International Nomenclatural Convention, whether they would allow us or allow anyone to do this, but certainly in the Humboldt Forum, we could make a start.
Yeah. But what I think of is that ultimately it comes down to the discretion of the institution and the specialist. You know, that is where change can start. The fact that, you know, there are so many species hybridized in the Berlin Botanical Garden, of which the begonia is one of them, which to me begs two questions. The first is certainly, if not the Humboldt Forum, the Berlin Botanical Garden can recognize this history. If nothing else, especially given the uniqueness of the holotype, both for what it has meant for institutionalized botany, but also for the fact that it survived, and what in fact is in a botanical garden. And many, for some, the question of a herbaria and sort of seeing the dried specimen often literally flattens what the processes of acquisition have been like. And the acquisition of this particular specimen is something that I think could be made more apparent, if not in changing the name or in drawing attention to its name, at the very least as a question of accountability of German sort of intellectual history. Sort of how did this happen? What were the infrastructures in place that the Botanical Garden used to source these specimens? And in so doing, I think the question of the monetary, the very quantitative, direct, tangible approach that Meenakshi is suggesting, which I completely agree with, that all scholars or researchers from the Global South should have access to this. I think equally some investment in resources should go to the local population in Berlin that visit and see the begonia in a greenhouse, a structure that in itself could have much attention drawn on, but that it's not simply passed by. I think those would definitely be the sites to start.
Thank you so much. Meenakshi, I'd like to come back to one point of your presentation, which was the giving of funds with no questions asked, no strings attached, to researchers of the geopolitical South for their research in the geopolitical North in regard to herbaria. Now, we earlier were speaking about the economic interests and the economic impact in total of the colonized practices of botany. And so I wanted to understand, on a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being the most radical, how radical do you consider this solution, this alternative to be in an effect of undoing some of the harm that has been done through centuries? And if you don't consider it to be too radical, I'm wondering what could be even more radical? How can we move forward? Perhaps even something that is utopian, but something that we need to discuss in order to put something onto the field and move forward. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, Meenakshi, and then gladly also what you, Anna Maria, have to add onto that point. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. So you want me to address the somewhat delimited reparative strategy I suggested, which is making these collections available with a lot of funding provided for researchers in the Global South to come to the Global North. Well, I would place that somewhere on a scale of 1 to 10. For me, that is a 4. or maybe a 3. I mean, what I would want to see without a doubt, and however idealistic this might sound, is a complete change in redistribution mechanisms, a radical redistribution of resources between the geopolitical North and the geopolitical South. I can see Anna Maria nodding. Yes, she obviously wants this too. But the right question to ask at this point is, are there ways we can make a beginning on this in a small way with a specific project and then perhaps use that to move forward? That's what I would do, because there is no one-size-fits-all decolonization, as Priyamada Gopal pointed out. So asking a question and making a beginning itself would be a very hopeful act, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Anna Maria, do you have something to add to this?
I agree with the numerical placement of Meenakshi having this sit in the 3 or 4. So I was with you, I was thinking about that myself. I'm like, I think we are ripe at the stage where that should happen. But I also am curious, when I think of the scholars that would have access to this, more often than not, they would have the social capital that would lend them, sort of the steps to even imagine that point of access to be able to see the holotype and ask for that infrastructure for their own research. And I wonder about what it means in a local context. And to that, the local for the begonia, you're covering, well, it was, named as a genus in the Caribbean, but, as I mentioned before, it was first at least represented and documented in Mexico under Western epistemological frameworks. And then, you have it's spreading through the entire continent. You have begonias that are native to the Americas, pretty much, from Mexico down, even around the south of North America, the southern coast. And the people who would benefit from this, what I think is overdue sort of access that Meenakshi is describing, would probably still need some local context to which the foreign botanical garden doesn't immediately give something. I would say that kind of taking the discussion a little further outside of the begonia and the horticultural, but thinking about, well-trodden discussions around patenting of seeds, of which in agricultural context, there are leaps and bounds beyond just looking at sort of these horticultural specimens. I think the question, as we were talking about before, Yolanda, of patenting and sort of what are the moments in sort of this species economic history that could translate to a concrete reparation for communities on the ground should be looked at. The questions of how the specimen has translated to specific wealth, but in the context of other specimens, innovation and technological sort of infrastructures, for example, around pelleting with Begonia sempliferens. This is a huge question. The powder that is the natural seed is almost imperceptible. As you know, it would have to fit into the plug that only occupied 2 rings of my fingerprint. So one thing that many horticultural companies do is actually surround the seed with a chemical coating and have it be that you can more easily count them. And by counting, you are limiting what can go into a packet. One packet, like the one I bought, could have 5,000 seeds. Pelleted packets could have somewhere around 50. And the harder seeds to have developed this pelleted industry, which is not only applied to Begonia sempliferens, but is applied to many other species, often proves harder with smaller species. So it kind of lent, as you will, a litmus test for this innovation. I would like to see something that's not just a species-specific reparation, but the kind of technological innovation that spreads beyond it as something that needs to be kind of taken into account. So not just the extraction of the seed, its growing and dissemination, but actual really concrete innovations that have continued to represent a gap of wealth between the global north and global south.
Yeah, thank you so much for your thoughts on that. And I think that this is really insightful. We could take this conversation to another level around this. Thank you so much. And now I would like to see what the audience has for questions. We have been using the VoxR tool. Michael will have the questions prepared, and let's take it to you, Michael. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was really exciting to listen to them. We got a few questions, but we are also running late already. And some points I didn't understand very precisely, but I will try to summarize the questions, and maybe then we can try to make one or two answers and that combining that, and you both can decide. As one question refers to, could gardens be transcultural spaces? And they're referring to, and my French is not existing, in Jardin de Acclimatation, if this is right. I think there's a relation to yeah, in German Völkerschauen there. I'm not sure, but the intention of the garden was like this, showing not only plants. Then another question goes to of naming, and on the naming is an erasure, as Yolanda Vasquez also told it. And this refers to, would you only erase names, or also the Limpschen taxonomy system? I'm not an expert in that. Now it's sad that we don't have the audience here to clarify the question. Linear and taxonomy system. I think Meenakshi knows what we are talking about. And then we have one question referring very to your practice, Ana María, which is like, did you realize a new intimacy in your relationship to the begonia? And could experiments like this be helpful to create new alliances in between species? And one person is already saying, thank you for the very interesting discussion. They also can go with that. And then we have one more question. Is saying, what violent boundaries of distinction and separation are still kept up by botany and other science? So we have one question going to the garden as transcultural spaces. One question going to your experiment, Ana María, and creating alliances. One question going to the naming and erasure and the taxonomy system. And yeah, and one question also is raised is how do you as a scientist, Meenakshi, approach herbariums, and what kind of questions are you asking there? So maybe, Ana María, do you want to start with the question, with the answer?
Yes. Thank you very much to the audience member who posed that question. I would say that conceptually, it might allow for openness of sort of the idea of how species interconnect with each other. But I have to be honest in saying that I feel that if anything else, I have sort of continued reifying the role that Begonia sempervirens has been given in society as germinating for, under human intention in contexts that are very foreign from its original moist tropical environment, so specifically often in rainforests. I feel that in sort of questions of more than human relations or interspecies connections, are often reinforcing our own anthropocentrism, or at least I feel it consistently so, in sort of a rhetoric in terms of describing what happened, which is still ultimately an act by a human on a plant, in this case on their body. However, what it does point to me constantly, and I mentioned this to all of you when we were preparing for this session, is it was one species that I had this kind of connection with. And with one species, the history of the human sort of structural injustices, particularly Western sort of structural injustices, were made very apparent. If this is happening with one species, what can it be with so many? And in this context, hearing or looking at broader sort of questions of environmental intervention that have led to mass destruction of biodiversity, extinction, anthropogenic ecological alteration, it starts becoming clear and clear that there is a starting point with how we name. I don't think that it's just a question of sort of alliances between species. I think if nothing else, it's the thundering reaffirmation of just how we are consistently, often manipulating our environment to ill effect, but led by people who have profited by it for centuries.
Yeah, thank you. Meenakshi, do you want
Yes.
to... Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, Ana María has put her finger on something that is very obvious, at least in the Indian Ocean context and South and Southeast Asia, which is that the environment was radically transformed by the moving around of these plants, so that it is worth asking whether today's ecological crisis can be studied through the lens of the kinds of movements of plants that occurred within the British Empire State, within the French Empire State. But the question that was addressed to me that is very interesting is, I think the question is thinking about gardens as transcultural spaces. Now, gardens were always already transcultural spaces from the moment they were established. I have no doubt about this with reference to the gardens I study in India. The hard work is undoing the labor that made indigenous labor invisible. That's the work we need to do. That sort of work, I'm afraid, doesn't show up in the colonial archives. That's the kind of information that you would have to do very deep ethnographic work, I think, to be able to recover even partially. But they always were transcultural spaces. There's no question about that.
Thank you. So,
yeah.
I would hand over to Yolanda.
And that was Gardens of Empire, the first 99 Questions event in a series of many more to follow in the year 2022. There has been so much to unpack. There's been so much of learning and unlearning that has happened. And this has just been the beginning of a conversation. Just to sum it up, there's been some groundwork in terms of the terminologies. Meenakshi Menon took us to the Calcutta Botanical Gardens. We looked at the year 1733 and understood a little bit more about land ownership, as well as paper preservation, and what time it is on the world clock in terms of decolonization. It was great also to hear Ana Maria's ingenious and fascinating bodily research with the begonia. And it's really been something that will stick with me, and I'm hoping also many of you, in terms of what is possible today, and also how we can change our relationship to the ecological crisis, and moreover, with the last statement that Minakshi just had, how to make indigenous labor perhaps more visible through something such as crossing out colonial names. I want to thank you all. I want to thank the both of the experts who have joined us. Thank you so much for sharing your time, your knowledge, your wonderful insights. It has been such an honor to hear from all of you and especially to learn from all of you. Of course, I also want to thank Michael Dimiger and Julia Richard, along with the technical team who have made this possible. This would have not been possible without the entire team that's working here in the background. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. A big thank you to everyone who made this happen.
Fantastic.
Yes. On screen and off screen.
One last word. My name is Yolanda Rother. It's been a pleasure to host this session, and I hope to see many of you at the next dialogue in the series of 99 questions, which will take place on March 21st with my dear colleague Sammy Blazingame and two excellent speakers. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening and goodbye. See you soon. Ciao.